I would like to introduce our speaker for today. So excited to have Robert Sakata, who is the Colorado Department of Agriculture Water Policy Advisor. He serves as a dedicated liaison between CDA and other state agencies who work with agricultural stakeholders and focuses on building relationships with water organizations around the state while still acting as president of Sakata Farms in Brighton, Colorado. He was born and raised in Colorado and grew up on his family farm and has served in a wide range of positions and advisory boards for agricultural and water-related organizations. I didn't name them all because there's really too many to name. He helped form both the Colorado Ag Water Alliance and the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, where he served as the founding president. So please join me in welcoming Robert. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. Perfect. Which button do I push for advance?
This one,
right one? Okay.
or just arrows.
Right, the arrows, sure. You bet. Okay, thanks. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, the list of things that I was able to really felt fortunate to be involved with. I really look at it now, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background and history and how it's led up to me taking on this new position at the Department of Ag. But it's also because people often ask me, well, how did you have the time to be involved with that? And then they would also ask me, on our family has a farm in Brighton, Colorado. They'd ask, so Robert, what are you doing to mitigate the impacts of that your farm has on climate change, right? So I would look them straight in the eye, and I told them the biggest thing that I did was I didn't have kids. And so that allowed me the time to be involved in a lot of other activities. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And maybe it's
right screen, but there you go. Should go.
Perfect. So this is a picture actually of me planting onions. This is looking out the back window of the tractor. I guess online I can't see you raise your hands, but raise your hands. How many of you are farmers or grew up on a farm? So I have an idea. Oh wow, look at this. Okay, so great. Well, our family has a farm in Brighton, Colorado. This is a picture of me when I was planting onions at night. And it's our family's got an amazing history. And I actually encourage everybody, that we should all have our parents or our grandparents write a book about their histories. Because I was actually lucky enough that my dad has such a history that they actually wrote this small biography about him. And I learned so much from reading that book because, as we're growing up, it's kind of amazing where we don't really think about asking our parents about what they went through. And yet, as I visited with people about that, it's really amazing the things that they went through. And I think it's important for us to keep track of that heritage. My dad's history is really amazing in the fact that he was a teenager growing up in California when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so when World War II started, he was his father, his two sisters, and a brother that had a small truck farm operation in the San Francisco area. And they lost everything because of the internment camp process. So they were, told that I think they had just 2 weeks or something, and had to pack up just what they would carry in a couple suitcases. They were put into the San Fran racetrack, I guess, at first until the camp was built, and then he ended up actually in a internment camp in Topaz, Utah. But what's really amazing is that his high school ag teacher there actually, during that time period, moved to CSU and was part of the ag school then. And my dad was actually able to get him to write a letter that essentially he took responsibility for my dad, and my dad was able to get early release from the internment camp. And he moved to Colorado because at that time, a great book called The Principled Politician is about Governor Ralph Carr, who was the governor of Colorado at that time period. And the governor felt so strongly about the Constitution and human rights that he took the extremely unpopular position back then of saying, hey, most of these people are American citizens. They have the right to live wherever they want to. But you can imagine in that time period, after the Japanese had that surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, that a lot of people didn't want to have people of Japanese heritage living next door to them. And so it killed Governor Carr's political career. He ran for office again, but was defeated, and he just was never in any type of elected position before. But really, that's why my dad moved to Colorado, was because he didn't have anything to go back to in California, didn't feel comfortable with that. But then worked, he gives all the credit in the world to the Sluter family, who in Brighton at that time had a dairy farm. And he worked for them. They allowed him to actually sleep in the milking parlor. And they found out he even actually on his own and re-enrolled in high school in Brighton and was going back to school to finish his high school. And they were so impressed with his work ethic. And they found out that if my dad owned property in Colorado, that he could get the early release, he could get the rest of his family released from the internment camp. So the Sluter family, believe it or not, back then bought 40 acres of ground and just deeded it over to my dad and just told my dad, just pay us back whenever you can. And that's how my dad got his start in Colorado. The favorite story my dad likes to give is that 2 years later, he went back to Mr. Sluter and he said to pay him back. And Mr. Sluter looked at him kind of cautiously and he said, Bobby, because that's what my dad's name is Bobby, but he called him Bobby. What bank did you rob? He was so surprised that my dad was able to pay him back in 2 years. But from that's my father and my mother built up an operation in Brighton, Colorado. Like I said, at one time we were farming about 7,500 acres, all fresh vegetable production. And I thought we had a great business plan, right? Brighton, Colorado, we're just north of Denver by about 20 miles. At that time, we had potentially 3.5, 4 million people within a 50-mile radius, especially for fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. I thought, gosh, this is perfect. But what I really failed to take into account was I was also competing for all the resources with those people as well. So the land, the water, which we're going to talk about, the people that I needed to help me on my farm. And then the biggest hurdle that I couldn't overcome, and I think all the communities now are feeling this, is the housing crisis. Is that I was having to hire about 450 people just for 2 months to help us on the vegetable farm. So can you imagine me trying to find housing for 450 people just for 2 months? It was an impossible hurdle. And I tried to go through some permitting processes to build some type of seasonal housing. But that's not what the communities want. They didn't want that type of housing. They wanted housing, of course. They needed housing for their full-time residents. And also from an economic standpoint, it didn't make sense that the money that was going to spend on housing and just use it 2 months out of the year was pretty foolish investment for me. If I was going to invest that kind of money, unfortunately, it was probably going to make more sense for me to build houses and sell them than it was to do my own operation. So we're really lucky right now. It's kind of sad. We're with the last major landowner in the Brighton area. And so the local small dairies are just really glad that we are able to grow feed for them. So we're growing corn silage. We also grow rotational crops of pinto beans, winter wheat, triticale as a mix. So instead of having 450 employees this time of year, right now we just have 14. So it's a big change in our operation. But it's interesting. One of the things that I was able to be involved with was on the CWCB, the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And one of my fellow commissioners is county commissioner from Chaffee County, and he's a fishing guide. And as we started to talk about what I was dealing with on the farm, he goes, wow, he says, you know what? Farming is just like fishing because it's an occupation of hope. And I couldn't agree with him more that that's what it really is. It's partly exciting that each season we get to start again, but we're always hoping that we're going to have a better year next year. But what's really scary, and part of the reason why this new position was created, this graph is showing um, uh, the number of irrigated acres and then the years across the bottom. And these are figures, numbers from the USDA Ag Census that's done once every 5 years. So 2022 census data was just released in February. And so these are just snapshots in time. So it's not a continuous measure of irrigated acres. And this is also you have to take into account also this is self-reported data. So this is what farmers are reporting that they're irrigating. But you can really see that there's a clear downward trend where it was above about 3.3 million in 1997, and it's dropped down to about 2 million. So we've lost over this 25-year reporting period, irrigated acres has decreased by over 1 million acres. That's a 32% reduction over 25 years. If we continue this pace, what's going to happen to irrigated agriculture in Colorado? And that's the real question. Reasons, I think they're pretty self-evident, but one of them is this figure from our state demographer's office, the population growth. And you can see in red, Fort Collins is one of the red areas, and you guys have seen this, the massive growth that's here. How many of you raise a hand if you were born in Colorado? Right? Yeah, so this is all you guys' problem. You guys are the problem, right? But we're seeing massive growth in Colorado. I mean, it's supposed to slow down, but our growth is still expected to outpace the rest of the nation. And um, this also is a snake diagram, which shows again the state, and the size of the arrow really indicates the volume of water in the rivers. So the other challenges we have is that we have over 80% of the population is here on the Front Range on the eastern slope, and yet 80% of the water is on the west slope. I don't know. My mom, she's so wise for her age. And I told her some of the work we're doing, some of the different water projects going around the state. And she goes, why don't the people just move to where the water is instead of trying to move the water to where the people are, right? But I've talked to people on the West Slope and they're not too excited about that either. Uh, but it is the challenge that we're going to be facing, and one that where agriculture right now is using upwards of 80% of the state's water. We really need to be at the table and talking about how we're going to manage water in the future. And of course, the other stressor is climate change. This QR code will take you to the Colorado Climate Center's recent report update on climate change, which really indicates that over almost the last 20-year period, 24-year period, temperatures have increased about 2.3 degrees. And they're forecasted by 2050 to double that, increase again another 2.5 degrees, or as much as 5.5 degrees. And so that increase in temperature is really going to put a huge stress on our water supplies. The report continues to go on, and it can not only is the average temperature, the probability of high temperatures very high. It's uncertain the range of precipitation. So looking at historical trends, we're not too sure if we're going to get more or less rainfall. But that still means that we're even just with increased temperature, things like our soil temperature are going to be higher, droughts could be longer and stronger, and then it's the ET rates are going to be higher. So we're going to put a bigger demand on our water supplies just alone with increasing temperatures. And then also you can see on this graph where it's very high likelihood that runoff timing is going to increase. So we're going to see that water running off of the mountains earlier, which again is a challenge for farmers who need that irrigation water to last throughout the year. This, of course, continues on with the heat waves. Droughts probably will be more frequent. And then we're hearing a lot. I just heard there's another wildfire today. I heard that on the radio. Yeah, so there's a wildfire that just broke out again today. So we're going to see increasing likelihood of wildfire. So one of the challenges for agriculture is we're going to address in this is how much, I'm going to ask you guys again with a raise of hands, how much of each dollar that you spend on food, so you go out and spend $1 on food, how much of that dollar do you think makes it back to on-farm production? Raise your hand if you think it's the 21 to 25 cents per dollar. Nobody thinks that's that much. Okay. How about the 11 cents to 20 cents? A couple people, right? And then less than 10% make it back to the farmer. Wow, weird animation, right? So here's the breakdown, and you can see so those of you that said less than 10%, you are correct. Farm production, on average, only gets 7.9 cents out of every food dollar. Only 7.9 cents. And that's where it all starts. Is the farm is where it all starts. Without the farm, nothing else beyond that can happen. And yet that's how we've managed to build our economy so strong too, is we're only spending about 11% of our disposable income on food, much less than some other developing countries, of course. So that allows the consumers to have that money to spend on other things, whether it's cars or vacations for their children. And even though we're hearing on the news that food prices are increasing, that margin that's going back to the farm is not. Unfortunately, it's not. If you look on this chart, one of the biggest portions of it is food services. So when we're going out and eating. And then also, we're also busy. How many of us now make our own salads? Do we buy our different lettuces and chop it up? Oh, good. I'm glad you do. Thank you. Most people are buying those pre-chopped salads now, and all of that processing is not making it back to the farm. The farmer can't afford to build a salad plant just for their salad that they may, or lettuce that they may only grow for a couple months. And so, again, that increase in food costs is really because of all the in-between steps. So another challenge of how farmers are going to keep up with these changes. And of course, this is a map of Colorado. In Colorado, people will often ask me, we're in a semi-arid desert. We have such a short growing season. Why do you even want to farm here? Right? Wouldn't you want to farm someplace else? Well, there's actually a lot of advantages to farm in this climate. I always tell people when we were growing vegetables, and in January when it was minus 15 degrees, and it was cold for the whole month, I was cheering like crazy. Why? Anybody know why? Because it was killing off the bugs. Next summer, I would see a lot less pest pressure because of that cold weather. I really felt bad for my livestock friends who were out in the cold weather trying to feed their animals. But for us vegetable farmers, it was ideal. And it was actually also helping soil health because that moisture in the soil was freezing and thawing and breaking up that soil and kind of aerating that soil. And so even though we have a short season, there's really some advantages of growing in this climate. And then in a drought climate, it's always better if we have external irrigation water to actually irrigate our crops when the crop needs it, rather than depend on Mother Nature, when it could come at the wrong time, it could come too much. If, for example, if it comes right before harvest and you need to get in there to harvest the crop, it's a muddy mess. And so there's advantage of that dry climate. And then also it's an advantage because of the reduction in uh, pathogens that attack the plant. So lower humidity levels will have less fungal problems than they do in the Midwest, where humidity levels are really high. Well, some of the challenges. This is Since we don't have any farmers in this room, I'm gonna have to explain this picture, right? This is what's called the 3-point hitch on the tractor. So it hooks the tractor to the implement behind me. This again was my onion planter. And when we're planting onions, there's a very short window where you plant it. Once the conditions are right, because such a long season, it takes all summer long to grow. You need to plant it right away. And so once I started planting onions, I literally almost planted around the clock until I got it done. Well, my 3-point hitch was broken and I couldn't get it fixed. And I literally took the belt off my pants, and you can see the belt right there wrapped around the hitch to keep it going until I could get done. And no, I didn't do this. This was one of our employees decided when he was irrigating one night, he was going to take this loader out to go check the water and rolled it over. Um, but then this picture I thought is always appropriate. Sometimes, I don't know if you feel this way or not, but you can see the front wheels on this sprayer. One is going left and one is going right. Which way do we really go? And sometimes that's really, even though that's just a picture, I think that's really some of the challenges that we feel on farming. And so sometimes that occupation of hope really seems to fade away. Well, this is the drone footage that I took of one of our fields, and you can see the mountains in the background. You can see the dry land, but to really take a notice of the houses, I really didn't notice this until I took this drone footage, how these houses are really creeping up on us. And then you're going to see the South Platte River is going to be coming up, and you'll see all those ponds. All those ponds are actually, well, gravel has been mined, and then the pits have been lined with bentonite, so they're sealed, so the water can be contained in there, and then they're used for water storage. And most of those are owned by municipalities, again, to meet the increasing municipal and industrial demand. Then also right below us is the ground that we don't own that other farmers have sold off, so the ground is now dried up as that water's been moved off and moved to different purposes. Online, I can't hear me on the other side. Pretty So that was a hailstorm. 2000, I can't remember for sure. I think this was 2013, a hailstorm, where it's so frustrating that you work all summer long, right? And then in 10 minutes you can lose your entire crop. So the picture on the bottom is actually the onion field total loss. And so when you think about it, really, I wasted about 230 acre feet of water because I irrigated that field all summer, right? And yet I didn't get anything out of it. So really, it doesn't matter what area of work that you're doing, whether it's crop protection. Hopefully, maybe some of you can come up with weather modification that can prevent hail. That's actually saving water because losses like this can account for really a wasting of water. This is a picture of our sweet corn that was also damaged in a different hailstorm a couple of years later. And I thought it was really appropriate that the Denver Post, the magazine or newspaper at that time, had in the headlines, Colorado farmers say industry must get smart. And really, that's such a valid statement that we really, especially with our diminishing water supplies, really need to figure out new ways to doing things. Well, when I graduated high school, the last thing I wanted to be was a farmer. I saw how hard my parents worked, and I just thought there had to be an easier way to earn a living. So I went and studied molecular cellular developmental biology, and I won't say where because I value my life here. I know you guys had a hard weekend, but yeah, sorry. I know I ruined it, right? Uh, but when I graduated high school, I idealistic. I wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize and find the cure for cancer. So I thought molecular genetics, that's the direction I wanted to go. And I minored in child psychology. It was a really exciting time. I applied molecular genetics, Amgen, helped them build their first research lab in Boulder. It was kind of fun. It was actually in a strip mall next to a shoe store. So it was really kind of different. But then I came to the realization and finding out in research how competitive it is, and I was just like, wow, just my the and I realized afterwards that not all labs are like this, but it really shook me when the postdoc that I was working for had me hide lab equipment from my other lab partners so that we could publish and get results first. I know. It was crazy. It was like, wow, this is not what I signed up for. It was like, what am I going to do now? And so as you can imagine, I was really disillusioned. And so I think, much to my parents' dismay, I went up to Steamboat Springs and taught skiing. But it was probably the best thing in the world. The good Lord was really watching out for me because I got to teach 3 to 6 year olds how to ski. And one of the first classes I had, this little girl, she comes up to me and she pulls on the pant leg of my ski school uniform and she goes, teacher, I think I'm in the wrong class. Well, I looked her, she had a name tag on, it was Bethany, and I looked on my class list, she was on there. I asked her, I said, Bethany, why do you think you're in the wrong class? Well, there was this long, awkward moment of silence. And then she finally gathered in and breath and looked up at me with her big blue eyes, enunciated as clearly as she could. Teacher, do you speak English? But the whole winter was like that. And it really recharged my batteries to see the world again through children's eyes. I responded to Bethany. I said, yes, I speak English. And we were fine for the rest of the day. That's all it took, right? How many of the problems that we face could we really solve by just being honest with each other? Being willing to ask those questions that we think may be really horribly stupid, and then be really open to hearing those questions and not offending people by the questions they ask and looking down on them. So that was probably the life lesson that has affected me and followed me my whole life was what I learned from a 3-year-old. It was pretty amazing. But the smart thing I did, so if you guys ever do this on your own, after college you decide you want to go skiing or something, the one smart thing I did was I was only there for one season. I saw too many people that were there like me searching for something, and then they got stuck and they were unhappy. And I wanted to make sure that I had held on to those happy memories instead of being there thinking that was going to satisfy my needs into the future. So, of course, what did I do then? I moved to California and became a bartender. I thought I'd use the minor in child psychology that I had, right? Um, and so it was interesting. California was booming at the time. I lived in Encino, worked in Westwood. It was about a 30-minute drive if there was no traffic, but normally I'd have to leave 2 hours in advance, and either I'd be there right on time or I'd be an hour and a half early. And I was stuck in traffic one time, and that was right when drive-by shootings started up. And I said, you know what? Maybe finding that cure for cancer that I was looking for and searching for when I graduated high school was really to go back to the farm. Maybe really helping my parents out and having the opportunity to grow the fresh vegetables there. So I was welcomed back to the farm. I was really thankful for that. And I was really very surprised that, all of our employees were really excited to see me back. And I think something that I realized later was that um, when I graduated high school, it was really a scary feeling to think that decisions I could make as the owner of the farm could impact the families that I had grown up with. I don't think I was ready for that. I really had to come to the understanding too that going back to the farm, it wasn't going to be my decisions about what we do. It was going to be our decisions. That all of us as working together on the farm, we're going to be making the best decisions moving forward. And so I've been really happy that I've been able to come back to the farm. These are actually some pictures of our farm. That's my onion planter at sunrise, right when I'm reloading the planter. It's a wonderful way of life, as long as you can live on 7.9 cents out of every food dollar. And that's the challenge. The diversity of agriculture in Colorado is really amazing. Upper left-hand corner is a picture of sweet corn harvest in the Olathe area. Bottom left-hand corner, that's potato harvest in northeastern Colorado. Upper right-hand picture, that was a picture of, again, planting onions. And the bottom right-hand picture, that's actually us when we were harvesting onions. But the strength of Colorado agriculture is really our diversity. And one part of my new role, and I'll go and get into this a little bit later, is that really to make sure that when we institute new policies, that we're not diminishing that diversity. I think that's so easy to happen, that you're trying to help or fix one problem, but then you create so many more beyond that. The labor issue is one that you'll hear farmers really talk about, the shortage of qualified labor. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to get that tackled. This picture on the upper left is actually a laser weeder. So that's a totally autonomous laser weeder that uses machine learning. You train it what plants you want to keep and which ones to take out. It actually has to identify the species of weed because it's adjusting the strength of the laser, because the power consumption is so great that it really adjusts the strength of the laser depending on the weed that's there. In the bottom right-hand corner, the knives are out of the ground just for demonstration purposes here, but it's using the same kind of thing. So it's using visual cues to identify the plants, and then the knives go in and out depending on the spacing and what's needed. So I'm really excited by the opportunities for overcoming the labor challenges that we have. But the water one is a little bit different. This is the staff at Colorado Department of Ag. So this is our flow chart for the staff. And you can see on the upper corner is where they put this new position, the Ag Water Policy Advisor. I was telling Karen that I'm really lucky because all the other division directors have these big staff, and I'm the only one that doesn't have any staff. So I'm really lucky that I'm the staff of one, right? So I just have to give instructions to myself. But also the different divisions, all those different items, things that were involved with water, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But this position was created last year by the state legislature. I started and applied, and I started this new job in January. Part of my role is to report directly to our Commissioner of Agriculture, Kate Greenberg. In the past, this was a position really that probably the Commissioner of Ag took the lead on, but now the Commissioner of Ag is dealing with so many different things. You guys familiar with high pathogenic avian influenza? It's hit the state pretty hard and taken out several facilities. The birds in the facilities, they've actually had to take them out because of the disease moving through there. And it's also now started to show up on our dairy herds as well. The wolf issue is another issue that the department is handling. So the Commissioner of Ag has so many things on her plate. It really has made sense that we have a dedicated person now to talk about water. Familiar with the Colorado Water Plan? So the Colorado Water Plan originally was developed in 2015. It was just revised 2 years ago. So there's actions in the water plan, and especially in the revised one, there's action plans for joint work with the Colorado Department of Agriculture and the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And the goal is for really how do we maintain or really increase and have a robust agriculture in the state. These three items are part of some of the things that are identified in the water plan. And then also this role is really focused on developing policy and research, whether it's working with educational institutions like Colorado State University. That's why I really want to reach out to the Water Center and develop that connection with the Water Center. NRCS, conservancy and conservation districts around the state, other ag organizations, whether it's the Colorado Corn Growers, whether it's the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. And then there's water policy organizations around the state. One of them is the Colorado Water Congress. And then conservation groups, whether it's Ducks Unlimited, Environmental Defense Fund. We really have to form some new partnerships as we move forward. And then also really this liaison with other state agencies. The other state agencies are really involved in water policy. And so it makes sense that we have a person dedicated, whether it's the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which meets every month. So I'll be actually heading to Monte Vista tomorrow morning early for the board meeting. The Groundwater Commission meets quarterly. There's 9 basin roundtables around the state, and I try to attend all those. Interbasin Compact Committee meets up twice a year. CDPHE is the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So those are all the water quality issues around the state. Anybody here working on PFAS? Forever chemicals? Yeah, yeah. So good for you. I'm glad you're working on that. Good luck. So there's a lot of water quality issues that we face that are important to everybody. And then there's 70, this is wrong now, 74 conservation districts because a couple of them, two of them melded together. So again, this new role is really to bless you, is really to coordinate those efforts. I'll be actually hosting, we're calling it the Worker Bee Summit, hosting staff from the Colorado Water Conservation Board and Colorado Department of Ag are coming to my farm, providing them a little tour, and then we were just going to go over what each of us, our responsibilities are, and see if there's ways that we can really work together to have, I want to see if we can actually do more by doing less, by just understanding what each of us are doing. So far this year, it's been a wonderful opportunity for me. I've attended 80 in-person events and probably closer to 160, 200 virtual events. I was just on one right before this meeting started. The Gunnison Basin Roundtable meeting is going on right now. And I've had the opportunity to present on 34 of these events across the state of Colorado. It's amazing growing up on the farm. I was born and raised in Colorado, but I never really had the opportunity to visit and travel our state in the summer months. And so now having this opportunity, now I have a better understanding why all you guys are coming to our state. We really do have a pretty nice state, but it really is putting a lot of pressures and demand on the resources that we have. And so also I've really reached out to have not only discussions with farm organizations, but really partner organizations. Because as I mentioned, I think that's going to be so important. You know, we have that term called wicked problems, right? Wicked problems are not solved in the normal way. They're not solved by our stovepipe way of thinking. We're going to have to look beyond that and see what partners we can have. So I've met with the Metro Denver Chamber of Commerce, Northwest Council of Governments, Southwest Water Conservation Districts. The next one, actually, that's a picture of he and I. So that's Paul Briley. He's the Director of Agriculture, essentially Commissioner of Agriculture for Arizona. I found out that he and I were speaking in a conference in Denver, so I invited him to stay at my house instead of staying in a hotel in Denver. And I was surprised he took me up on it, and he even flew out a day early so that I could take him on a tour of our farm. I tell you, I learned so much by just interacting with him on a tour on our farm, and I hope he learned something about Colorado agriculture, because I don't know whether you've heard this on the news or not, but there's a lot of controversy going on the Colorado River right now because there's negotiations going on. How the river is managed, those terms are going to expire in 2026. So negotiations are going on right now of how the operations of Lake Meter and Lake Powell are going to be moving forward. And so the Colorado River is divided into two sections, essentially, the lower basin, which includes California and Arizona, the two major users, and the upper basin. And so this is a very important discussion. So having a chance to visit with Paul was really important, I think, and hopefully will be meaningful into the future. Well, topics around the state, as I've traveled, it's really interesting because I probably on this slide, I could have just put in big red letters, short of water, right? That's the problem. We're short of water. But it's interesting as I travel the state that it's manifesting itself into really particular issues, depending on the infrastructure of the basin, depending on the uses in the basin, and depending, of course, on the people in the basins. So have you heard about Aurora's recent purchase of about 5,000 acres in the lower Arkansas Valley? So Aurora, the city of Aurora, as you can imagine, being on the eastern part of the Denver Front Range area, it has the most potential for growth of almost any of the other metropolitan areas. It can actually double in size. Uh, and so to meet that growth, what do they need? Water. And the way they have gotten some of that water in the past was they actually went down to the Arkansas River Basin, so not out of the South Platte. They've gotten water out of the South Platte as well. But to diversify their portfolio, they've actually bought water rights out of the Arkansas River, and through infrastructure or through exchanges, they managed to get that water then to Aurora for citizens to use. They made an agreement with the entities down in Arkansas, and everybody down there thought that meant they weren't going to go down there anymore and get any more. That's not the way they interpreted the agreement, and so they purchased another 5,000 acres. They're making they're presenting it in the fact that they're going to keep it in farming. So they're not necessarily drying up the farms. They're going to keep it in farming, but they'll have the right to take the water off of that farm 3 out of 10 years. Uh, so you can imagine, I was describing the challenge of what we call interruptible supplies to somebody. I was saying, it's so hard for us farmers because what are we going to feed our cows in the years that we don't grow crops, right? Or what are we, if I'm selling vegetables, that that grocery store is probably not going to come back to me next year if I haven't had anything for them one year. And this person, the light went on it, and she said, "Oh, it's like quitting your job." And I went, "Yes, exactly. If you quit your job 3 out of 10 years, do you think you're going to get hired back? Probably not, right?" So to make these interruptible supplies work, we're going to need to find products or a market that actually will match that return. It can be done, but we're going to have to look at new ways again to do things. So you can see the list that goes on and on. And unfortunately, about halfway down, you'll see revegetation or reclamation. Unfortunately, one of the first things that I'm having to work on, I wish I could work on that, how we're finding more water for agriculture. But one of the first things that potentially you're going to see in our state legislature next year is a bill making it making more requirements on how we revegetate land that has been irrigated, but it now has been dried up as the water's been moved off. That land, as it's been irrigated, has changed over time. So it can't necessarily go back to its original state, but we're going to have to find some way to reclaim it so that it just doesn't end up to be a dust bowl of sorts. And so, unfortunately, that's one of the first things that we're working on. I said I was at the Colorado Department of Ag, some of the different departments that we have. One's working on ag water quality. Nutrients are a big deal, especially in groundwater and surface water. The conservation boards dealing with conservation practices around the state, just not only in soil, but in water. We have an ag drought and climate resiliency office, energy programs, soil health program is really important and really expanding as we, learning how we can improve our soil's health, hopefully retaining any um, precipitation that falls on it instead of watching it wash off and take the soil with it. And then we're also working out ways how we can market this because again, farmers are only getting 7.9 cents out of the dollar. How do we reward them for doing some of these efforts? So we're looking at things. Are there ways that we can develop markets that the consumer is willing to pay extra for? For example, if it's a climate smart commodity, are they going to be willing to pay for a local product that's using these techniques? Have you guys heard of Dia Cero, Day Zero? So Day Zero has been in the news recently, and that's the date that Mexico City, with a population of, I think, 21 million people, are going to run out of water. Pretty scary. Very, very scary. That's why it's really incumbent on us to be thoughtful in our process and our planning purposes. Unfortunately, in Mexico City, half of the problem is just their old infrastructure. Half of the water is leaking before it gets to the people that need the water. So we need to, not only is infrastructure important, but I think we want to be thoughtful about where our water is coming from. Part of my role, again, is really to look and reach out and talk with municipalities. These are all pictures taken within the last month of my travel. And can you see the picture on the left? That's xeriscaping, right? But they're still running their sprinkler. It just cracked me up. It was like, wow. So I guess they thought they were doing a good job by xeriscaping, right? So we can't assume anything. We have to be thoughtful in our process. I mean, and in reality, the percentage of water that municipalities use is actually a pretty small portion. Agriculture, like I said, is using at least 80% of the water. So a huge amount of savings can come from agriculture if we're thoughtful about the way we're using it. Part of the research that maybe some of you will be doing will be working on crops that can use less water, crops that can be more resilient to drought, crops that can, uh, uh, deal with the extreme heat that we're going to be feeling. Um, but also, as I've gotten in this role and looked at it too, is partly convincing our municipalities that this uncontrolled growth or unthoughtful growth is not smart. For a future that we don't know what's really going to happen, doesn't it make sense that we're preserving some of the ag farmland, that we have that buffer, that we have that open space? Also, too, I think I recently saw a study from China saying that this ag land is playing a hugely important role on mitigating heat island effects that we're starting to see in some of these larger cities. So again, being thoughtful about not only when we're growing, where that water's coming from, what agriculture are we taking out of production. There's models that are being worked on that look at public information like soil types, water infrastructure, that you can start to model this and you can take a look and say, hey, this piece of ground is really great soil. It's great infrastructure going to water. Is it worthwhile that this is the one we save? If we're going to dry up something, maybe let's dry up a less productive piece of ground. But we, of course, in that standpoint too, we need to be very thoughtful because we don't want to tell that farmer that farms the less desirable piece of ground and tell him, you have bad ground, you can't farm it, right? That could have been his whole family's history is on that piece of ground. So we have to approach this thoughtfully. But I think we can do it with having good conversations among ourselves. And this, unfortunately, I include in all of my presentations. It doesn't matter who I talk to, is that suicide rates in farmers, unfortunately, are 3.5 times higher than the national average. We can understand it with the stresses that they feel and the isolation that they're in. I mean, during COVID, right, I was taking pictures, selfies of myself and my tractor where I was normally. I was always self-isolating. But unfortunately, we're seeing in the agricultural population with the stresses that they're seeing a higher suicide rate. So one of the things, the legislature last year, the Department of Ag will be starting what's called the Behavioral Health Community Practices Work Group, where we're getting practitioners and peoples with life experiences together and talk about how we can improve rural mental health. I think it's really important that we do this as we move forward. Why? This is a picture of my dad on the left. So I always thought this was a fun picture to end it with because for so many farm families, it's about the legacy. It's about continuing on that history going forward. But also, I'd like to point out in this picture who's working and who's not. Yeah, right? I don't even have a hat on. What farmer doesn't have a hat on? It doesn't have any gloves. So you can tell that was staged, right? That was staged for the Colorado water plant. So I want you to know. Uh, but really, thank you for your time and attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And for those of you that are interested in the water career, I think it's really where it's at. Really, we really need to be thinking about that. I mean, the solutions. When I think about this, I've come up with some pretty wild ideas. You want to hear one of them? Out in the Pacific Ocean, we're going to put this giant humidifier, and it's going to pump humidity up and catch the Pacific rivers that are coming in, so we get more moisture right on the west slope. Who knows? But other ones are like we're having a huge challenge with data centers, right? Data centers are using a huge amount of energy and water. A data center actually reached out to me and was interested in buying some of our property. I asked him, have you ever considered partnering with a greenhouse facility to use some of this excess heat? And they went, no. I went, I think you better start thinking about this. Let's start thinking about how we can support agriculture with the development we're facing. So as you move forward, one of the biggest issues is storage of energy, right? As we move toward renewable energy, how are we going to be able to store this energy that we're generating during the day and we need it at night? Plants may be the answer. They've been doing it for millions of years, right? So it's up to you guys to figure out how we can do that and move forward. Well, thanks. I'm open to questions.
I'll take a question from the class first, and then we'll go to you. Yeah. So this was great. Thanks very much.
Sure.
I have some questions about your farm. You said you switched over from vegetables to basically feedstock for livestock.
Yep.
When first question, do they use the same amount of water?
Yeah, so the question is, when we changed our operation from vegetables to feedstocks, do they use the same amount of water? And for the corn silage is actually taking more water than some of our vegetable crops. And that's why we've mixed it in with winter wheat, pinto beans, and triticale is again to balance. We only have a set amount of water essentially, or it varies from year to year, but on average, we know how much water we're going to get. So we had to balance that out.
Does that silage come in the same price as the vegetables?
So the question was if silage demands the same price as vegetables. And the net per acre, it depends on the year. It was a shame on vegetable production, and we're so productive in the United States that it's a shame that the only way that we had a good year in vegetable production is if somebody else had a disaster. because we overproduce. And it's a free market system. So if there's a lot of vegetables out there, the retailers are paying bottom price for it. And so it's the vegetable market was really a roller coaster ride compared to the grain market, which unfortunately also it's less of a roller coaster ride, but it's still kind of goes up and down a lot.
But it all goes to local dairies.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was where our silage feed goes to, and then, yeah, so it goes to local dairies. It's like I said, it's kind of sad. One of the biggest expenses when you grow silage for a dairy is getting that silage from the field where it's grown to the dairy itself. So we're very lucky that we're within 5 to 10 miles of these dairies. So it works great for them and it works good for us.
I don't want to dominate this, but can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
We have some of the largest livestock numbers, especially in World Farm in many places. Are they all getting local food, or do they have to import from outside the state?
So the question was on because of the livestock numbers in northeastern Colorado, if they have to import feed. And I'll have to research that. I think they actually do have to import some feed into Colorado. Colorado can't produce all the feed for all the cows here.
A question from
Fort Lewis College. Yeah. So question from Fort Lewis College.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. So there's a question here if the Colorado Department of Ag is looking into the viability of dry or dryland agriculture.
Great question. So, and that's part of the conversation we're having in this revegetation bill is there the opportunity for the farm to go from irrigated to non-irrigated, but still be in some type of farm production? And current research shows that it really depends on the soil type. There's just some soils that are not going to support dryland farming. I mean, if they're sugar sand, they don't have any moisture holding capacity. They're not going to retain any of the natural precipitation that comes there. So it's really going to be on a site specific basis. And that's another area where our soil health program is not just focusing in on irrigated acres, but also in pastures and dryland operations. Because if we can, through the practices, increase organic matter in those soils, they'll have a better opportunity of retaining moisture. Right. Other questions? Not a PFAS question.
No.
Good.
Can I ask a question? Hey, Robert, how are you?
Good.
This is Eduardo speaking.
Hey, Eduardo.
How you doing? Nice to see you, buddy.
Good to see you too.
Robert, quick question. You mentioned about the water quality group that is working in the Department of Ag, and so can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because Troy Bowder and I were talking with some of the folks that were doing gray waters and black waters and the potential use of this in agriculture and produce and farms. And so can you elaborate a little bit more, understanding that you really know the produce safety rule and the requirements with the FDA and all that? Can you describe a little bit more what is the vision within the Colorado Department of Agriculture for that quality perspective and management, please?
Sure, you bet, Eduardo. So at the Department of Ag, the water quality program was initially set up because of the concerns about nutrient runoff from farms, so both nitrogen and phosphorus. And it was focused in the beginning was totally groundwater. A group of farmers, we actually said, a lot of people were pointing to agriculture and saying, hey, you guys are polluting our streams and rivers, our groundwater. But we didn't have any evidence or data. So we passed through our state legislature a bill which essentially taxed ourselves. So we tax any fertilizer or chemical purchase. And then that fund funds the program. That's a partnership between the Department of Health, Department of Ag, and CSU plays a role in that as well. And that started the monitoring process. So we started putting out monitoring wells because, again, it was focused on groundwater, and then doing the analysis of what are the nutrient levels so that we could get some trend lines over time. And as you know, it takes a long time to develop if you're going to look at trends on that way. Well, the program was so successful, and it convinced really the Department of Health that how important this data was, that, we're not like the Midwest where there's huge rainfall events where they have what are called tile drainage lines. They have so much water that they actually put these underground lines in to drain all that extra water out. And so you can imagine that those tile drainages are going to be carrying a lot of the soluble nutrients with them. Yeah, and we don't have that in Colorado. One of the biggest, another benefit of being in a semi-arid desert is that we don't have that potential for that runoff, except for these huge storm events, which we could see. And so the program was expanded into surface water as now. So now we're beginning to measure surface water on the side. But to Eduardo's question on the food safety side, that was one of the scariest things for me as a vegetable farmer, was that the last thing I wanted to do was make anybody sick, right? But we grow food outside. You know, it was always tough because we were required, because we were selling our produce to the major grocery chains. The program was set up where we would have to invite a third party to come in and perform an audit on us to view our food safety practices. So it was everything from our growing conditions to our how we harvested, our harvesting techniques, our cleaning and sanitation techniques, our storage techniques, our traceability, the whole step. So I mean, the audits for our farm would usually take about 3 days, an auditor coming out for 3 days, wanting to visit every part of our operation. And part of that audit, amazingly enough, was that they would be really watching out for animals in the field. And they'd even go to the point where we'd be walking the perimeter of the field, they'd look for animal tracks. And if there was animal tracks, we had to ensure that we had a policy to cover what we were going to do if we found any potential source of contamination. On the irrigation water side, you can imagine that irrigation water, if it's contaminated, has the huge potential of contaminating fresh produce. And so FDA over time has adjusted their policy. At first, they were using numbers based on generic E. coli over a certain length of time. But every place is different. You know, not all pathogens are the same. You're using generic E. coli kind of as this indicator organism to say the risk may be higher if the E. coli counts are higher, but it may not be true for Listeria. It may not be true for other types of pathogens. And so they moved away from that and now doing a program where each farmer is supposed to analyze their source water and determine the risks that they feel are there. That's a huge responsibility for a farmer to analyze this. You know, we're not microbiologists. We're not out there really to make anybody sick. But water quality is a big, big effort. And one of the biggest things that I was really concerned about, because I did serve on the state's Water Quality Control Commission for a number of years, and so was really familiar with water treatment, with wastewater treatment, is that I was afraid as a farmer, I don't want to make anybody sick. So what's the first thing I could do? I'm going to go out and buy a bunch of bleach and dump it into my irrigation water, right? No, bad idea. You have those, what are they called? Disinfection byproducts that can form whenever you're using chlorine products like that. Bad idea. And so, because that's the direction that it's going now, is that farmers, they're finally coming to a point where they're labeling some products that can be used for food safety purposes in irrigation water. But it's a really scary thought to think about uh, the irrigation water and the risks that are going on. And part of it, I'm going to go on my soapbox here, and this is not Department of Ag thought. Part of it is why, too, I think we need to do everything we can to support local. I'm really concerned about how our food supply is becoming so centralized that, you know, we're depending on the Arizona area for 95% of our leafy greens in the winter months, you know. And that's partly why these food safety regulations have had to become so strict, because it used to be that one head of lettuce, if it was contaminated, maybe it got one family sick. But now that one head of lettuce has the potential of going into a salad factory and contaminating batches of lettuce that are traveling across the state, and to have the potential to get hundreds of people sick. And so it makes sense. That's why the food safety regulations need to be so intense. But the same sense, these food safety regulations are really driving to that consolidation even more, because you're having to look for a food safety expert. You're having to hire somebody to do that risk analysis in your waterways. And small seasonal operations like ours in Colorado can't afford to do that. And yet, so it's this double-edged sword that, yes, the larger site is creating the greater need for more food safety regulations, but it's driving the smaller operations out, which really we should be keeping, because I think it's creating some diversity there, which is important. So that's one of my goals, even though it's not a water policy issue, is to figure out ways that we can have local farmers better market their product. The consumer seems to really want to support local. Colorado Proud is a program. They're really willing to look at it. But how we identify it, how we get it to those citizens are going to be really important, because It is. It cost me, when I was growing broccoli, I could only grow one crop of broccoli per season in Colorado. In California, they could grow three. So my costs of production were so much higher than California because all of that overhead costs, that tractor that I was buying, that harvesting equipment that I was buying, I could only get to recover it over one crop per season where they could for three. So the returns to farmers growing in this area have to be higher, in which the consolidation of our retail industry, that they're not able to garner that right now because it's all about price. Eduardo, did I cover what you wanted me to? He's gone? Okay, good. No, sorry, Eduardo.
So I had a question about like water conservation programs. I'm in ag and resource economics, and like on when and how farmers choose to engage in water conservation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a specific programs where farmers can receive compensation for conserved water and safe for downstream users. My question to you is that do you think that programs like this or other programs like necessarily like favor certain kinds of farmers, like whether it's a larger farm, what they're growing, where they are, and like what's some barriers to entering?
Perfect. Is Fort Lewis still on, or are they off totally? They're still on. So the question was on some of these conservation programs now are trying to reward farmers for their conservation efforts. So are those types of programs favoring one farmer over another, or an operation over another? And that's a great question. And that's one of the challenges that we have in Colorado. Is it's a strength that we have diversity in production, but it's also a challenge when we start to form policies or programs like that one size doesn't fit all. So when we talk about water conservation, in particular, when we're talking about Eastern Plains on the Republican River or the Rio Grande, where they're dealing with groundwater supplies, that's a totally different situation than when we're talking about surface water supplies. Groundwater supplies, they're not those dedicated operations. They don't have recharge, and so to compensate them for savings in the water is pretty straightforward. When we're dealing with surface water supplies, especially along the South Platte, and another issue that really complicates it is the return flows that occur. So again, that water that's being used, only a certain amount of it's being used by the crop. The other portion is actually being retimed when it makes it back to the river, and somebody has probably developed a right on that return flow. And then also, there's been a lot of work on trying to figure out how you market that conserved consumptive use, but at least on surface water systems, the prior appropriation system and the water court system is so complex, and water rights are so complex that it would be tied up in court forever trying to define, everybody trying to agree on how much that conserved consumptive use was. That's the biggest challenge. And so that's why right now most programs are either totally dry up or not, because it's easy to say you've conserved all that water that used to be used and you're not using it rather than a portion. It's harder to prorate that in programs. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it does favor some over the others, depending on their operation. Yeah, because the other thing, when I was growing vegetables, there was no way that I could do, what's it called? There was no way for vegetables that I could reduce my application deficit irrigate. Sorry, there was no way that I could deficit irrigate, because I always explain to people there's a big difference between an ear of sweet corn that I'm trying to sell at King Soopers versus an ear of corn that's going to go to a cow, right? Cow doesn't care if that ear of corn is 3 inches long, but the consumer, there's no way I couldn't even sell it to King Soopers if it was less than 3 inches. And the consumer wants that nice green husk on the outside, right? All those appearance things. So there's no such thing as deficit irrigating vegetable crops. So as a vegetable grower, I probably wouldn't be able to participate in a program like that. But great question. Yep. Any other questions online?
From us, thank you so much for your talk.
You bet. Thank you.
Well, let's give Robert one more.
Thanks, everybody.